see here. And so a lot of the work I do, and I put it in green because it's a peaceful color. It's a color of calmness. And I'm sure you appreciate that in particular. It's the work we do that involves compliance. It involves training. It involves helping people to understand how to have good policies that enhance security. And I call it left of boom because this is the concept we use a lot in the military and in intelligence. It's what happens before something bad happens. But of course, bad things do happen. They go boom. And then there's the right of boom. These are the things that come after something has gone badly. And these could be litigation. It could be dealing with incident response. It could be dealing with the insurance claims and all that. So my practice goes from one side of this to the other, from the left to the right. I really prefer for myself and for my clients to be in the left side. It's much less stress. The right side is higher stress. It's much more expensive for clients and for governments. And we try to stay away from that. Try to keep people from having to spend time there. But of course, we know that that's not always what people do. So some basic ideas about the talk today that I want to put out there first to situate us, to point the north and south on the compass. So first, I still believe very much that cybersecurity is something that comes out of the concepts from the military and espionage. It's only very recently that it's really become something that is particularly relevant to the private sector and non-military and espionage. For most of history, it's been something that either the military or spies have been involved in. And by cybersecurity, I really mean what we used to call information security and information warfare. So in my mind, really understanding some basics of how that works really helps to understand what we're dealing with today on these cyber threats. I also think it's important when you're trying to anticipate what tomorrow's threats are going to look like. You can pay a lot of attention to what you're seeing today that's coming from the high end, the top of the tier types of threats. And those usually are nation states. 5-10 years ago, I would have said that was a group of a couple of countries, maybe 5, maybe 8, 9, 10. Today, it's a much bigger group, and it's a group that continues to grow and sometimes grows very quickly. There are some countries that in a couple of years appear to have no cyber capability, and then immediately they have a tremendous. North Korea, for example. So that makes anticipation of these threats very difficult. The other part here that I think is very relevant to what we're talking about today is attacking supply chains as a basic approach to any military espionage activity. It's always been this case. If you, when you think about military operations, there's a saying that amateurs think about tactics, professionals think about logistics. And that's the case in the military. The most difficult thing to do well in a military context is logistics. Many, many wars have been won and lost, and many great campaigns have been won and lost by those who had good logistical supply chains, or those who didn't, or those who were able to prevent the other side from using their logistical supply chain. So this is very important, and it's not that different in the environment of cybersecurity. So let me give you a few ideal control supply in the desert control systems area. And he was speaking of the attack on the Ukraine power grid, a very sophisticated attack in many ways, and in other ways not so sophisticated. But I think this is a great quote. It says, he looks at it and he says, it was brilliant. And in terms of sophistication, most people in the cybersecurity world, and he's absolutely right about this, they tend to focus on the malware, the code. How did they get in there? What did they use? Was it a phishing email? Was it something about Citrix, or was there some flaw in Windows that allowed them to get in? And really what he's saying here is that's not really what makes this type of attack so sophisticated. What makes it sophisticated is the logistics, so how they set up the attack, the planning, and the operations. And those three words, which are very military in mindset, really are the things that are uppermost in the type of supply chain attacks that we're talking about. Now, this gentleman, Rob Joyce, one of the most talented and senior people at the National Security Agency, and recently has been appointed to a high-level position at NSA by President Biden. Excuse me. He has had a number of roles at NSA, including being in charge of one of their top-tier hacking teams. And he, like many others in NSA a few years ago, understood that NSA has two missions. One is offensive, but the other is defensive. And I think that they understood that their defensive mission had not been as active in explaining to companies and governments how to prevent and defend from attacks. So he began to speak more about that. And this was him at DEF CON. This is one of the hacker conferences that, well, right now they're not happening obviously with COVID, but it's a great place to go and be in an amazing social network of hackers. I think anyone in this business should try to get to DEF CON every couple of years or Black Hat if they can. But he spoke at this conference and he said a couple of things that are very interesting. So the first is he said, defenders need to understand that there's no such thing as a crack, a gap in defenses that's too small for someone to notice it or to exploit it. And then he said something else, which is, and I love this word, first seam. Seam is that gap between two things. When you have a zipper or you've got clothing, there's that line. You look for that first seam, and then you look and you try to find a way in to break open and crack in. And when you do, the problem is that the people who are doing this kind of offensive attack, they put a huge amount of effort into understanding that network. Sometimes they know it better than the people who designed it and the people who are securing the networks. In other words, the attackers, if they came to you and they said, I want to tell you about your network, they're going to tell you things that you would not know. And they also know the technologies that you intended to use, but also, more importantly, the ones you're actually using. It's a very subtle difference, as he says, what you intended versus what you're actually using. But the problem is that there are many networks where there are things on the network that you didn't realize are on the network, that they weren't supposed to be. Maybe they're old, deprecated technologies, servers that you should have retired because they cannot be patched. They're end of life. And because of that, they are exposed because there are vulnerabilities that are not being fixed. And until you know that, well, you're vulnerable to someone who does. So understanding your own position is very important in being a good steward of cybersecurity. So what are the characteristics of supply chain attacks? And this draws heavily on research around nation state attacks, but I think it's these days when you see private hackers, if you will, not affiliated with the government, they tend to observe the same kinds of approaches. So first, you typically see these as teams of specialists that will have a team that's responsible for reconnaissance, so understanding the target. There will be another team of specialists who are very, very good at the entry, how you actually exploit that vulnerability to get behind the network in some way, shape, or form. Then there are the teams, and these are often some of the best, most patient hackers on the team. They're the ones who exploit the entry and who move laterally inside the network. They have to be very skilled because they need to stay quiet. Most networks have enough sensors, have enough detection tools running on them that if you are noisy, meaning you do something that creates some attention, it could bring the security team onto you, and obviously you would lose the access. And then there's the exfiltration. What are you trying to get out of the network? And that's not always the same type of team. A team that's trying to exfiltrate data would be different than, say, a team that's trying to create the capability to bring down the network or to open the network up for additional uses. And this is where supply chains are important. You may be getting into one network and you're not really that interested in what they're doing there. You only get interested because it's the first place you would jump to somebody else, somebody who's more interested. So there's a very heavy focus on reconnaissance. There's also a very heavy focus on dwell times, on persistence, meaning finding a way to stay in the network, even if there's some discovery of some component of the attack. So leaving behind doors that can be opened without being discovered, or leaving tools in there that can be easily reawakened that are dormant if some other part of the attack is discovered and the attacker's presence there is taken down. This is becoming more sophisticated. So you really, when you have found a hacker in your supply chain, you have to be very careful of assuming just because you got them out of one thing that you've gotten them out of your system. Unfortunately, we see this very frequently, that a few months later, there's a second wave, a second type of attack that is discovered because we didn't really clean out the original one. They have a lot of patience and they have a lot of long-term presence in mind. Most of the time, they're more sophisticated, but I really want to stress here that sophisticated does not mean high tech. So yes, they're going to have 0 days. They're going to have ideas about hardware exploits that most hackers won't have, but not just. They're sophisticated in how they hack humans, how they hack social engineering, how they use weaknesses in an organization, in a culture of an organization, just as much as the technology. And so I often want my clients especially to beware, to not put too much stress on the best technology that money can buy, because that doesn't really solve the problem in these contexts. You have to have a whole of body type of solution. And put a different way, you could give someone a wonderful piece of biometric technology, maybe a great Apple Watch or something like that, to tell them health data. But if they're not really thinking about their body and what they're eating and how they're exercising, that's not going to help you. It's going to give you more data about a bad thing, not necessarily the way that the body is actually working. So this is another excellent quote that I think is important to keep in mind. This is also, I think, from Dragos, and it's research that has been done over years about the probing and the reconnaissance. And years ago, you might see a couple of hundred probes in a month. These days, the numbers are in the thousands or hundreds of thousands or higher that are happening all the time. A different way to look at that is, it means that if there is a weakness, if there is something that can be exploited, the likelihood that someone else is going to find it is nearly 100%. So if you haven't yet been targeted, it's because someone hasn't had time to turn to it, more likely. And then you think about it, it's only a question of time. So let's start with an initial example of a supply chain. So, and we're going to go back in time, more than 7 years. This is December 2013, and Target, a very large consumer goods company here in the United States and internationally. And at the time, it was one of the largest breaches that we saw in the United States. Over 70 million people were impacted. The costs of the breach were over 250 million, if not more. And there are, there's a lot of information about this. I in particular would recommend the paper that Terry Radishow did at SANS that describes all this. But what's interesting about this attack is the attackers clearly had access and could have researched a lot of information around Target by what was available. There were papers, there were reports around Target systems, reports that Microsoft had done, and they described a lot of information around how the network operated, where there were resources. What the hackers did is, instead of attacking Target directly, they actually went and compromised a third-party vendor, a company called Fazio Mechanical, that supplied refrigeration contracting services to Target stores, heating and ventilation systems, essentially. And what they did is they sent someone at Fazio a phishing email. They used something called Citadel. It's an older Trojan that was used for banking attacks. And they used that in order to capture login credentials, which they were able to do. So they got the login, the password, and login for someone at Fazio. What was interesting is some of the research has been done since then. This was a well-known Trojan. Most of the antivirus and malware detection tools in the market would have spotted it. Unfortunately, it appeared that the company here, Fazio, was using a free service that did not have real-time scanning, and so it probably would not have captured it. So they were able to get the Fazio to basically open the door to the Target network, and most likely it was through a platform called Ariba. And this quote by someone on the website, Brian Krebs' website. If you don't read that, it's a very good website for information about security. And he interviewed someone at Target, and he said that the Ariba system that has a back end that the Target administrators use to maintain the system probably was where it happened. And once a vendor had access to this system, they probably had access to the server that runs the application. So if you think about it, this is a vendor that provides heating and ventilation systems to Target. In order to connect with their system, they had to have a login, they got in, but once they were on that system, they were able to have access to a much larger supply chain of information than they really needed. And that supply chain, unfortunately, was not well secured. Again, from the same interview, this would mean the server had access to the rest of the corporate network in some form or another. Those are words that should send any system administrator into orbit, meaning very, very scared and very concerned. Because it means that there was not the right segmentation. It means that there was not the right level of privilege associated with accounts. And that is a problem in a supply chain, because what it means is you get into one place and you might have the whole network. And this is a good graphic showing how this probably worked. So you see on number one, the attacker probably phished the third-party contractor, so Fazio. Once they were in there, they used the stolen credentials from Fazio to get into the contractor portal. Then they found the internal Windows file server in that network, in that portal, and infected it. They also moved to the point of sale systems. That's where all the credit card information. And then they began using a malware scraper. So basically getting all the information from memory, which in many of these systems, unfortunately, the data is not encrypted there. It should be, but it's not. And then exfiltrating it and getting it out to an external server in Russia where they were able to use it. So this is the supply chain here. If you want to think about it, is what's happening at number one, number two, and number three. That's the weakness. Target had good security. It wasn't great. It wasn't perfect by any means. No security is perfect, obviously, but there was a breach. There was a hole in there because of their supply chain. So how do we deal with this problem? And it's an enormous problem. For some organizations, it probably takes up most of their attention in trying to secure their cybersecurity after they have done everything they can internally. It's something that I think, especially after SolarWinds, more people are understanding, but it's not a new problem. And here in the United States, and this is what we're going to focus on for the second part of this, we have been worried about this, particularly with our government contractors. So these are, the United States government spends an unbelievable amount of money every year on all kinds of services and buying things in the private sector market, whether it's COVID vaccines, paper, pencils, airplanes, bombers, ships. All of that is purchased from contractors. And the contractors that work in the defense area, so the work for the Pentagon, are probably some of the most important, because obviously they have information about national security, about defense, secrets, and all that. And there's been a lot of concern about how secure that supply chain is. So some examples of the kinds of issues we've had here in the United States around government contractors. One of the most significant events was in 2015, the Office of Personnel Management in the US government. One of the most important offices, one of the most important functions in the US government. It is responsible for all labor, all personnel issues in the government. So it has files on almost everyone who's working or has ever worked in the government. And in 2015, a nation state, now we know it's China, attacked this network and was able to access almost all the records on there. So anyone in the United States who's ever worked for the government around that time received a letter saying that your information had been compromised and had been stolen. It was an enormous, enormous scandal. 2019, another one, a company that does work for the Customs and Border Protection Service, so this is the people who protect the US borders, was hacked and had images of surveillance were stolen. Another one is an engineering services contractor that had their internal server hacked. And then another one is ransomware. A government contractor involved in manufacturing space and defense components was hit with ransomware. Ransomware can do obviously two things. It can destroy the data or lock up the systems, but a lot of the ransomware attackers also steal data before they launch the attack. All of these are examples, and there are many more, of cases where government contractors were hit by a hacker and had an impact on how the government was able to defend its cybersecurity. So what the US government, and particularly the Defense Department, began to do is they began to rethink what the requirements and how they were doing the protection of the supply chain. Until recently, until last year, in fact, this was a requirement, meaning that if you did business with the US government, you had to comply with certain practices. But interestingly, it was what we call self-certification. So you would assess, you would decide whether you were doing what you needed to be doing, no one else. Now, unfortunately, that's not likely to work well because first, a lot of people don't understand these requirements. And secondly, a lot of people don't take them seriously. And in fact, over time, there's been, very clear information that most of these government contractors, especially small and mid-sized ones, really weren't doing any of the work that they were supposed to be doing. In addition, in the defense space, there is a particular regulation under the procurement system, it's called DFARS, that requires that government contractors rely on a set of controls that are covered in a NIST special publication, 800-171. And I highly recommend that as a very good resource for anyone wanting to come up with their own approach to security controls. It might be too much for some organizations, but generally it's a great starting point for seeing all the pieces that should go into a security program. And interestingly, it's one that has a breach notification requirement of 72 hours, which I think is kind of the state of the art these days. The pressure on government contractors and on the federal government to improve this has been coming from our political leadership as well. This is Senator Mark Warner. He's one of my senators here in Virginia, and he has said a number of times that our third-party contractor and subcontractor cybersecurity is in a very poor state, and we need to do much more about it. And this is what eventually led to this new initiative, CMMC, the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. And the reason I wanted to talk about this today is obviously this is not a model that works well outside the United States, because very few companies would be subject to it unless they're doing business with the Defense Department. But I view it as a great beginning. It's not perfect. It has a lot of flaws, and it's going to be very painful for a lot of companies to comply with it. But I think it's a great initial framework for understanding how to secure a complicated supply chain, and not just in the private sector, in the public sector, but also in the private sector. And the goal that the Defense Department had with CMMC was to come up with some kind of unified cybersecurity standard that everyone who does work with the Defense Department as a contractor would have to comply with. And it has 5 maturity levels, and I'm going to talk about that. But interestingly, it shifts from accepting self-certification, which means I decide myself whether I'm certified, whether I'm complying or not, to someone coming in to test and certify from the outside, the third-party certification. That's going to be a very interesting year or two process for many contractors who are going to be tested by someone outside. And if they don't meet the standards, they may not be able to continue doing work for the government. So how is this supposed to work, the CMMC? So I'm sure you've probably come across the movie The Matrix. So this is a matrix of sorts as well. And as I mentioned, the CMMC has maturity levels, level 1 through 5. And the maturity levels are determined primarily in terms of what you are trying to protect and against who you are trying to protect. So first, what are you trying to protect? And in the US, and I won't spend too much time on this because it's very particular to the US system for information governance, but there are 2 types of information the government is concerned about. And this is all non-classified information. So this isn't secret, it's not top secret. This is unclassified information, but there is information that is important for federal contracting, that's FCI. And then there's the CUI part of it, which is controlled unclassified information. And this is information that is more sensitive. And I'll show you how those 2 definitions work. But the CMMC basically splits this into 2 categories of levels. 1 and 2 are really basic cyber security practices. In fact, level 1 is such basic hygiene that if a company is not meeting those, it's really questionable whether they have any interest in having cybersecurity. And so most government contractors at a minimum will have to be at level 1. Level 2 is really, it's probably not going to be somewhere where a lot of companies are going to be, because it's really intended to be a transition to getting to level 3, which is where most companies are going to have to be. And level 3 is what I would call good cyber hygiene. And then you may have some in 4 and 5, probably very sensitive operations, and those have many more controls. But if you think about it in terms of a process, at level 1, you know you're doing some things, but you may not know what necessarily and how you're doing them. At level 2, you begin to document. These are the processes on the right, to document, that is to keep track of what you're doing. At level 3, you're beginning to manage that process more effectively. At 4, you're spending more time thinking about how you're doing it and figuring out if you can do it better. And then level 5 is where you really spend a lot of time doing all of the other things, but also thinking constantly yourself of how you can do them better, rather than relying on things to happen to you first. So the kind of information that's being protected right now under CMMC, you have FCI, which is basically information that's not intended to be in the public, and it's really developed in order for the government to be able to figure out the contracting requirements. And then there's CUI, which is information that the government believes needs to be protected and safeguarded. It's information that the government creates, by the way, and this is an important point. So where did they come up with the CMMC maturity levels and how these are going to work? And it's primarily something based on NIST standards, the 800-171 that I mentioned before, and also pulling in information from the NIST 853 category of controls, which are intended for government systems. And it has a number of processes, and I'm going to show you something here that shows that more clearly. There are different levels of controls that come into play as you move up. So at level 1, there are just 17 controls. Level 2, you add 55 more. At 3, you are into a much higher level of sophistication. And then you see at 4 and 5, you're basically using the same controls, but really making the management of those controls much more sophisticated. And where do these controls fit in? Well, the boxes there on the left, the capability domains, those are actually drawn from the NIST. So they deal with things that you would expect to see in any kind of cybersecurity program. You would have access control. Who can get in? Who's authenticated to use the system? Asset management. How do you control what devices, what systems are on your network? Awareness and training, very important, because the human being is such a core part of any cybersecurity. Audit and accountability. How do you know that what you're doing is actually working and is getting done the way it should be done? Managing configurations. Most of these types of systems are fairly complicated networks. Managing the configurations on them is very important. The identification, authentication, incident response, very important. We assume things will happen. We assume there will be successful attacks. How quickly you respond is sometimes the most important fact in a cybersecurity response. There's also physical protection, something a lot of people often forget in the cybersecurity world. It sometimes is a lot easier to get into a system through a physical compromise. That could be getting a USB key into a server room that bypasses security. So these are the domains that are identified in CMMC. And then here on the side, you can kind of see as the levels progress, what the end result is. So at level 1, basic cyber, hygiene, intermediate, good, and then you get proactive, advanced, and progressive. And alongside that are the processes that you would expect to be seen. And then this touches on also who you're trying to protect against. And I would say, level 1 and 2 and 3 are general, they're focused on all kinds of threats. When you're looking at level 4 and 5, that is when you're really starting to think about reducing the risks from APTs. APTs are advanced persistent threats. They can be nation states, of course, but they're also the high-end types of attackers, the attackers that work they may have a lot of knowledge on how governments work. They may be ex-government experts. They may be contracting to governments in some places. We see this a lot in Russia. But 4 and 5 is really where you're starting to protect against that level of high-end threat. And what does the certification process look like? And this is very much an evolving process right now because it's very new. But the way it's going to essentially work is each entity is going to have a category that they're going to have to be at. And some of this is going to be in the contract. For example, the government may say, in order to be able to do work under this contract, you need to have maturity level 3. And so you're going to have to meet that level in order to comply and do that work. Other organizations may decide proactively before they begin bidding that they want to be at a certain level and they can get there, they can be certified, and then they can go and more easily bid for the contract. But in the long run, what will be happening is every organization, every government contractor will go through this, they'll get their rating, and then that's going to be put onto a database that will be accessible for the government contracting agents and those in the government who need to figure out whether the person or the organization is at the right level. And if you're not, or if you fail the audit, that's going to have consequences, meaning in all likelihood, you will not be able to do work with the government, which could obviously be pretty serious for companies that do a lot of government work. So some of the reasons why this is going to be important here, this is the enforcement mechanism. You won't be able to do business with the US government, the Defense Department, if you don't comply with CMMC. Also, if you've ever had to do business with the government, you know that they have a lot of their contracts are usually fairly detailed. In the US and the defense space, you are going to have to attest that you are doing these things. And if you're not, there are all kinds of litigation that can and contract disputes that can come out of this with fairly serious consequences. And also, of course, if you don't comply with CMMC, you could also potentially be hacked and have all the issues that come out of there. So looking forward, what does all this mean and where does it get us in this world? So obviously SolarWinds, I think, is a very important piece of this, very much in the dialogue that I hope we'll have today. I think it's also important to anticipate that with the migration to cloud across everything that's been happening for a number of years, but now is accelerated, supply chain becomes as complex, if not more so. And then frankly, most supply chains in the cybersecurity realm and the data realm and the IT realm are becoming more complex. Networks are becoming more distributed. The use of mobile devices, IoT, all those things are creating a much more difficult supply chain problem. My general recommendation is there's no time like now to start tackling this challenge because these things are not going to get easier. It's not going to get simpler. And I don't think you're going to have easy technical solutions to these problems because they're not technical problems at the end of the day. They're often organizational problems. And I thought I would just put my email there, but also if you, that's an easy way to connect with me via LinkedIn if you're interested. And I always encourage people to do so and to follow up with me. So that's the presentation. And I do see, I think, a few questions here. So let me stop here and let me just see. So I'll handle the question that Adele posted maybe real quick, and then I'll open it up for other discussions. But the question, I'll just read it out, is, does the third-party certifier carry any of the legal financial responsibility when things go wrong? Not directly. So in other words, if the auditor makes a mistake or overlooks a problem, yes, they would have responsibility. But if they check and as with many of these things, the auditors are checking for how the system is implemented. They're not necessarily going to check the the details in the same way. The work has to kind of end at some point. So there is a break there. In other words, the auditor might say, we looked at your controls and the controls are correct, but then the control is not well implemented. That's where the responsibility transfers back to the contractor as opposed to the auditor. So let me stop there, and I would really enjoy and love to hear good comments. And if anyone, I especially would like if anyone has any strong disagreements with this or has any ideas on how we can do this kind of stuff differently, because I don't think anybody has the real answers. I think most of us just have questions and frustrations about these things.
So I have a question. It's just kind of general on like the general side. Like if, you know, what happens when you change the system, when there's a sudden change in the security strategy? Like how does the government or like the party deal with it? The continuous sudden changes in the security system. How do they deal with that?
Yeah, that's a great question, because first you have to understand when you're making those changes and you're imposing them on other people that it creates a huge amount of stress and fatigue, right? It wears people out when you're changing um, anything that they have to do that they don't understand or isn't part of their business, right? So if you're selling fruit and vegetables, cybersecurity, you may understand that it's important that your systems for getting payments should work every day, but you really don't want to worry about passwords and authentication and antivirus and all that. And so every time that one of these things is changed, I think we as security professionals need to be very mindful that the people we are putting all this onto are feeling already a lot of weight and strain.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to examine this. And I think medical examples actually work very well in this context. I know that we have viruses and worms and all those things. I'm not talking about those. I'm talking more about thinking of an organization as a living organism. And when you put so much strain, it's going to cause something to not work correctly. So the same way, if someone is not getting enough sleep, they're more likely to get a bad cold or to get sick. And I think when you keep adding all of these things to the security mix, people don't pay attention to the right things. So I would encourage organizations to be very careful about how much security they push out, because what will happen is there will be the important things will stop being done, and people will try to do the last thing that they were told to do.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Um, we also, I think, whoever has a question, they can open their mic and just ask right away.
Sorry, I'm getting a lot of strange feedback on my end. Are you hearing that too?
Yeah, kind of. I have no idea why.
Let me rejoin on. Let me try rejoining real quick here. Hold on.
Sure thing.
I'm going to do my audio from another device here. Hold on. Or maybe it stopped now. Is that?
Is it working now? Are we good?
Hold on. No, it's still bad. Hold on. Let me just try this here. Sorry about that. Okay, can you hear me there?
Yes, I can.
Oh, good. Okay. Yeah, that's much better.
Okay, we have a thing. I'm just gonna ask, what could breach a system? What could a breach in the system do if we did not prioritize supply chain?
Well, the the basic question in cybersecurity usually comes down to three letters, right? CIA, not the Central Intelligence Agency, but confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So any attack, you can look at it as a combination of at least one of those. So a supply chain attack could be focused on stealing or getting access to information that the attacker should not have access to, so the confidentiality. It could be an effort to try to deny the owner of that system or the users of that system the availability, having that system there for whatever purpose it's intended. So in a military context, for example, if you were to deny your enemy the availability of, say, a radar system or something like that, they might not detect an attack. So you could surprise them. And then integrity, that's a more interesting attack in some respects, but that could be where the organization that's being attacked no longer has confidence in the data. So the best example of that is every bank is always concerned about the integrity of their information, because while it's terrible when they lose money through an attack where someone steals, say, $1 million, if you can get into a bank and you change some part of their record keeping of their accounts, and you can't, and the bank's security cannot figure out what you changed, but they know that something changed. If that were to become public, everyone who has money in the bank would wonder whether the money really is what it should be. And so integrity can be extremely important in that respect. So every supply chain attack is going to have some element of that. And obviously, something like SolarWinds, the initial attack, you would say, would probably have been mostly about confidentiality, meaning getting access to information about the network and how the attackers could exploit other parts of the network. And as they moved into it, maybe they were able to plant stay behind types of attacks or do other things that might be turned on someday in the future and deny the availability of that network to the companies or the entities who are using it.
Great. We have a question from Anonymous. They say, do you think that at some point in the future, there will be a certain security level that might prevent any kind of attack, or there will always be vulnerabilities and gaps no matter how you improve the world of security?
I don't believe that there ever will be something that's 100%. There isn't in most things in any aspect of life, but I think in the cybersecurity realm, in the information and IT world, I think I consider that next to impossible, unless, and this is an old joke in the in the information security environment, a secure computer is a computer that's not connected to the internet, that's not connected to any other computer, that's not connected to any power. In other words, it's sitting there with absolutely nothing happening on it. That might be a secure computer until someone steals it, of course. But it's very difficult to think of 100% safe system. We know that there are plenty of effective attacks that have been done on so-called air-gapped systems that are not connected to the internet, because, well, first of all, most systems that people think are air-gapped are not in actual fact air-gapped. There's usually something that connects them externally at some point by accident or by design, but people who designed it didn't understand that. So I think it's very difficult to think of that. I think this is just something we recognize as an ongoing and probably
more challenging, not less, type of problem.
How can we detect system weakness?
You have to be an insomniac. You don't sleep, I think is my, no. I'd say the most important part of that is to think like the attacker you are trying to defend against. And it sounds easy, but it's actually very difficult. I think in the early days of information security, there were a lot of people who went back and forth between those two worlds. And so they could easily think, as a defender, I'm defending against this because I'm doing that, either because I'm running a network and I'm playing on those things, or vice versa. These days, we've become very specialized. And so I think that defenders tend to only be defenders, and obviously hackers tend to be only hackers. And so it's more difficult sometimes for the defenders to be thinking like an attacker. I think it's also important to have that in mind, because when you're a system administrator, when you're in a company, in a corporate environment, you are constantly trying to come up with ways to replicate what you're doing through policies and procedures. The problem with those in some respect is that they create a structure that becomes inflexible, and it becomes, a network, it's a matrix, and you forget about those holes that exist that may have been created. You begin to see the procedures as something that works well on its own, when it doesn't. There's a lot more that goes into it, but it's natural human tendency. So identifying weaknesses, I think, and flaws and vulnerabilities, it's really important to have the mindset of the attacker. Now, you can do that in a regular fashion, and that's by using red teams, by using tiger teams, some people call them, getting a couple of people who maybe know something about your system and asking them, and companies do this, they hire people. I work with people like this. You bring them in, you say, I want you to spend a month figuring out how to break into our system any way you can. And sometimes they tell the security team that's going to happen. Sometimes I actually like that, because the security team, if they know it, they'll do everything they can to keep them out. And if they still get in, I think it really reinforces the problems they have. Other times you don't say anything and you just see what happens. I've had clients, and there are many stories like this, where the person in charge says they'll never break in, and the next day they find a little envelope on their desk with all the information they thought they were protecting, and that the team not only was able to get into their computers, but they were able to get into the office, leave that for the person that was so confident, and they had no idea how they got in there. That can really send a very strong message that you've got to do some more work. Does that answer the question, I hope?
Yeah, it does. I'm pretty sure. Hamid Al-Hajri would like to ask something. He has his hand up.
Great.
Hamid Al-Hajri.
How are you? As a defender, or to defend the system, does it have to be constancy, like 24 hours, if it's for a big company?
Yes. So let me answer the question a couple of ways. The first thing is, 5-10 years ago, I think we could still think about defending, meaning keeping people out of the network. I think these days, most of us have abandoned that hope, and we now focus much more on detecting the attacker and being able to respond. And that's why continual monitoring, and most importantly, having the ability to play back what's happened in a period of time leading up to discovery of the attack is so very important. So many times the attacks that I get involved with as incident response, we never find out exactly how the attack began and what they did, because we don't have the digital forensic artifacts, the evidence, the information to figure out what went on before we discovered the attack. And that's difficult, and it creates difficulties on several levels. One is, it's hard to know what damage may have been done, whether everything has been compromised or just one part. So that means you end up spending probably more money and time than you might if you knew it was just this part of the network. The other problem is you don't know whether you've actually kicked them out. You may have to basically take the network down to 0 and rebuild from the ground up because you don't know where they might be. So defense should be 24/7, but defense should also be, I would say, 365 or more, meaning not Office 365, but having the availability of information on what happened on that network going back a long time. And being able to, almost like a time machine, turn the dial to go back until you see, oh, that's where that user's login credential was used with an IP of, say, Iran or somewhere else, or that user was logged in 2 times or at the same time on that date. One of them was at home and the other was in another country. So obviously we have an issue there. Might have been a VPN, but it might have been someone else. And then we can start moving the dial forward and seeing what kind of anomalies, because at the end of the day, what happens on a digital network is going to be recorded and represented in some fashion. And it could be that the data was deleted, but deleted data leaves a hole and you can see it. Now, you might not tell what was there before, but you know that something happened. And so that's a clue and very important. The worst situation, I will say again, is when you know you've been attacked, maybe you have ransomware, and you have no idea when it happened, when they first got into the system, how they got in, where they went, what they did. You're blind. It's almost like being in a you're at home, someone is in there trying to attack you, and everything is dark. You have no lights whatsoever, and you have no idea where they are and how to get them out. And you basically at that point maybe have to just sell the house, throw it out, move to a new house, which is much more expensive.
Thank you, Mr. Guillermo. There's a question: is there anyone who is suing the perpetrators of cybercrime?
Well, there are, and here in the U.S. and in some other countries, the government is prosecuting them as criminals, and so you will see there are some very interesting cases out there. There's one that I sometimes will use as an example as a hacker named Ramon Abbas, is a Nigerian who was living in the UAE actually, and he is the organizer of a group that the U.S. government thinks made hundreds of millions of dollars from cybercrime. And he had social media, and he would show pictures of his Bentleys and his Rolls Royces, and anyway, he's now facing he's in the United States being prosecuted. But those are very, very unusual cases because most of the criminals, most of the cyber attackers are in places that are not going to turn them over. I mean, think about the hackers operating out of Russia. The Russian government does not usually allow other countries to extradite them, to get them out of the country to be prosecuted. But also finding them is very difficult. The tools that they use, can shield them from identification. The really smart ones don't post on social media. They hide. They use anonymous services, and of course, for the criminals who are doing this for money, cryptocurrencies have been a great tool for them because they've allowed them to receive funding, not anonymously, because cryptocurrencies are not fully anonymous for the most part, but it allows them to receive money and move it from place to place very quickly without actually having to go there to get it. So they don't have to go and get a bag of money. They can get it over the internet and then move it around and get away with it. So it's very difficult to do that. So right now.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Guillermo. We're going to receive just one more question because it's been an hour. And anyways, one more question left. So as a defender, the question says, as a defender, I need to think like the attacker. Do you think that the best defenders were once hackers or attackers?
Yes, I'm convinced that the best defenders have been not necessarily unethical attackers, but that they grew up trying to break things. And a hacker, the traditional definition of a hacker is it's not a criminal. It's someone who wants to do something to a device or code, make it do something that the original engineer or designer didn't think it would or should do. And so you play with it, you find something, you make it do something different. And that, I think, is the heart of a good attacker, is thinking that way on in technology and in internet terms. And yes, I do think that great defenders also have been thinking and started out as thinking about how to break in. Yes, absolutely.
Just one more, for the sake of asking, does virtual machine prevent hacking?
No. No, and virtual machines can actually be used. A virtual machine simply means that instead of, that you might be able to isolate a process. So for example, a lot of security applications, a lot of approaches to security rely on virtual machines or virtualization to isolate a particular process from the actual system that you're trying to protect, so that you might get, the classic example is an attachment comes in that's detected by your security software as potentially malicious. So instead of allowing that attachment to open up in the regular system that you're running, you put it into a virtual machine. If the virtual machine gets infected or causes some issue, you can simply shut it off. It shouldn't be connected in the same way to the rest of the network, so it's contained. It's almost like a bomb-proof container. When they find a bomb, they put them in these containers so that if it were to go off, people around there wouldn't be hurt. The same thing with a virtual machine. You can use it for that purpose. You can experiment with it, and it's more contained.
Okay, so it would, like, with the Internet of Things and this crazy era that we're going through right now, how might cybersecurity affect development and implementations of the IoT, and what challenges occur during this process?
Well, at one level, IoT should only be different from regular devices on the internet, because they often control something that moves. And so you have that additional level of potential harm, right? If my Windows 10 computer crashes, I may lose some work, but hopefully, nothing stops working that causes physical damage. An IoT device actually could control something physical, right? It could control a door. It might control a water pump. It might control something that depends on a particular kind of issue regarding temperature. So that's one aspect of that. It's a little bit, so that's where the IoT is very similar to an ICS or industrial control system. The real problem with IoT, though, is not at that conceptual level, it's at the practical implementation level, which is most IoT devices are made very cheaply. They're very cheap consumer devices where there's very little security that was ever considered into them. So if you do any playing in that area, you'll find that they tend to have default passwords, if any password at all. The systems cannot be updated. They cannot be patched easily. So once a problem is solved, there's no real way to put new firmware on there or update the operating system to fix those problems. Therefore, much of the IoT landscape, many of the IoT devices out there are vulnerable, will never be fixed, and they're very easy to hack. And that's why they're a problem. And of course, they're on the same network as things that are protected. So if you're going to attack, why go after a Windows 10 machine that might be patched, that might be running good malware software, might be running a good firewall, when you can go after a cheaply made camera that is a computer sitting in that network and can be used as the staging point for anything else you want to do.
Yeah, that's amazing. So how can we protect our devices from spyware and surveillance devices used by governments, from spy companies like Sandvine, for example?
Yes. and I've actually spoken. When I was in Kuwait, I think it was 2 years ago, and I had a very, very great experience at the universities. I spoke with some journalists, and I've done this elsewhere as well. It is very challenging to defend against spyware because there isn't an easy way to detect it. The things that I recommend that people do are, first, avoid loading every app that you ever think might be interesting. Really only use the ones you need and the ones that you trust. Second, be very careful about modifying the software on your phone or your computer. Jailbreaking phones, for example, is a terrible idea because it usually destroys the security systems on those phones. You should patch your mobile phone software as quickly as possible. Meaning keep, for example, iOS on your iPhone or iPad OS as up to date as possible, because usually they're being updated because there's been some flaw. Okay. I would also be very careful about the same things that we tell people on phishing. You know, if you get strange links in a text message or a WhatsApp message, don't follow it. If a friend of yours sends you a message that says, "Oh, you should go look at this TikTok video," I'd go directly to TikTok and look at it there, or YouTube. I'd go directly. I wouldn't click the link, because most of the time spyware is delivered that way. The other way it's delivered, unfortunately, is if someone takes your phone. So keep, guard your phone well. Don't leave it somewhere where someone else can get access to it.
Yes. Adil Zari has a question. If you can.
Hi, Mr. Christensen. How are you?
Oh, very good. Good to hear from you.
Good to hear from you. Thank you. Very nice talk. Just one question, please. On an average basis, on a lump sum basis, from 1 to 10, cloud services, cloud data hosting, how secure are they? I know my question is very broad and depending on many companies, but just give me an average answer, if you don't mind.
I would expect no less than a great question like that from you. So thank you. I appreciate it. So I would rate the security of cloud as whatever the configuration and the people using it can be. It can be 10. It can be 1. The thing about cloud, and I get asked this question by clients all the time, should we move to the cloud? Is that really secure? And my question to them usually is, well, how many computers or how many how many servers are you running? And if the answer is less than thousands, I usually say go to the cloud, because whatever you are doing on premises with your own machines, you can't possibly replicate the resources that are available at a large cloud provider, whether that's Azure, AWS, whatever it is. The problem, though, is that a lot of people think, well, I'm paying them for this, so they must be doing everything right. No. It really matters what you are getting. Are you paying them not just for the cloud service, the space, whatever you're getting there? Are you also paying for the configuration, for making the service align with your security needs, which is something else? And usually you really need to have someone do that as an add-on to the cloud service.
Even if you're using their IaaS service and everything from their side? Again, assuming the infrastructure and the software.
Yeah, I still encourage there to be an add-on in the form of someone who knows their system is not them, right? There's that saying, who guards the custodians? So you do need someone who's overseeing them. If you're paying them to do the service, I would still have someone, at least at some point every budget cycle or year, audit and review the security practices and what they have committed to doing and whether they are providing you those services. I think that's really important.
And they do allow that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Good to hear from you.
Thank you, Mr. Christensen. We have 3 more questions. In the world of physical robots, we might face security vulnerabilities which can lead to a catastrophic disaster. Does cybersecurity affect the development of robots?
Oh, yes, absolutely. It should. I don't know if it always does, but robotics, if you think about it, we're just talking about IoT, industrial control systems. Many of those are robots. And so if you think about it, the ultimate danger type situation that we're thinking about is where you have a system controlled over the IP network, over the internet, where the end result of that is some device, a robot with something that moves, that can be controlled, and then that control can be compromised by an attacker anywhere else. And that's the problem. And here's where, you know, the integrity and availability issue becomes so key in the CIA concept of information security. If I can deny, if I can make that robot stop working, so not be available, for example, I could maybe bring a plane down. I could stop an elevator from working in a building. I could stop a bridge from opening or closing. I could do all those things. Similarly, on a factory floor, I could cause an industrial robot to start doing something completely different than what its function is and begin destroying something of value. So robotics needs to have security development built into it in a very significant way, and some do and some don't. In a sense, autonomous vehicles are robots, if you think about it. An autonomous vehicle that's going to move itself around is nothing more than a robot on wheels, right? And we know all the concerns around information security around those. I'm sure you've read about the infamous case of the Jeep Wrangler that was hacked on the control systems, so that the driver all of a sudden lost control, the brakes were on, things like that. That's all. It's not a movie concept. It's actually things that can be done and have been done. So robotics needs to have the security of the system very much in mind. And the more critical the function of the robot, the more critical that issue needs to be addressed. And also have in mind that whereas a computer maybe that becomes compromised could simply fail and have to be rebooted, a robot might need to have a number of fail safes so that once it begins to get attacked, it defaults to some state where it doesn't cause harm, where it doesn't cause damage.
So can smart card? Oh yeah, sorry. Go ahead, Mohammed. No, go ahead, Mohammed.
Do you think that cyber attacks are a threat to the automotive industry? And do you think that smart cars, security systems in general could be easily breached?
Yes, I think it is. It is a very big issue for the automotive industry. It's not. I don't know if I would say it's certainly not the highest priority for them, but it is definitely going to be an issue as we move towards the higher ends of the autonomous spectrum for vehicles, because at some point there's no human safety, and some of this is a cultural thing. Human beings are very poor at risk assessments, and a lot of people think that they're much better drivers than computers. I would hate to, I think that that's wrong. I think a fully automated driving system is probably going to save an unbelievable number of lives, but it's still going to be vulnerable to these things. So I think that the autonomous vehicle market will, when it grows into something successful, it's going to be because we have built real defense in depth in those systems, a very clear approach to resilience. So when the system fails, it fails over to states where it does not cause harm. It's very similar in some ways to the aviation sector. And it does, in my mind, bring up a very big question that I know a lot of people think about, and that is, the way we design software these days isn't like we design planes. We put out software that we know isn't going to work well. That's why we have, all the things that we deal with apps and phones and computers. It's okay, because if it fails, it usually crashes, you reboot, you reinstall the system, and you're fine. It doesn't work very well on an airplane. If the systems on an airplane crash catastrophically, these days they're all fly-by-wire, the plane's not going to do very well. So you can't allow the same level of experimentation. These have to be fully vetted, excellent pieces of software, and they don't always work that way. The Boeing's been struggling with that. So I think when you're dealing with these systems, we're going to have to go back to a far more quality-focused way of writing code and testing it than has been the case for now. And I think for a lot of programmers, that's going to be an interesting cultural adjustment. So.
Yes. Well, we're going to close for now. Thank you so much, Mr. Guillermo, for, this fruitful and amazing seminar. The IEEE of Kuwait student chapter and Dr. Abdullah Ghalaf, our counselor, thank you so much for today. If there are more questions, we will definitely email you and we will send them your response, inshallah. Thank you so much. And thank you all for attending. This was an amazing experience and we learned a lot, actually. So thank you so much, Mr. Guillermo.
My pleasure. And I hope I'll be able to see some of you or all of you in person in Kuwait soon. And if you come to Washington, please let me know.
Inshallah, of course. Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining for today. Day 1, we're done. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.